Is the film Zulu racist? Now, Zulu was a film that was made in 1964, and it tells the story of the British soldiers, about 140 of them, who held off thousands of Zulu warriors during the Battle of Rorke's Drift. If you're interested, I recently made a video about this, and that's actually why I'm making a video now, because actually coincidentally I made that video as part of my Sabaton Stories series, and very recently there was a showing that was meant to be done in Kent and did actually go ahead in support of the veterans and their families by the SSAF, and they were going to show the film Zulu there because it's a classic of essentially the British military. It's an old one and much loved by the British public. However, there were 28 protesters who protested against the showing of this film, saying that the film was racist and inappropriate for 21st century Britain. And because I've just made this video, I thought, why not make this video to look at some of the aspects of this, see whether I think it's true or not. And at the end, I'm going to have a poll to see what you guys think about this, because I think it's an interesting discussion to have. So they said in a statement, and I quote, "We believe that the choice of the film Zulu, with its inaccurate portrayal of historical events and its distortions and racist overtones, could have a negative effect on relationships within the changing and richly diverse communities here in Folkestone." So first of all, I'd like to take a look at this here. Inaccurate portrayal of historical events. Now, there are several inaccuracies within Zulu. On the whole, actually, it's a very accurate portrayal, in my opinion, and the opinion of historians who have looked at this, of the events at Rorke's Drift. And many of the inaccuracies are rather very minor details, and from what I can tell, not many of them actually have to do with the Zulus and the whole aspect of the racial interplay within the film. Now, one of the main inaccuracies is that most of the men in the film are shown to be Welsh, because one of the directors was Welsh and wanted to essentially show off his homeland again with the baritone singing and all of this, whereas in fact most of the men in the regiment, it was an English regiment. There were very few Welshmen present, so that's one of the inaccuracies, but that doesn't really seem to be anything racist. Another is the portrayal of the De Witt, who is the Swedish missionary there with his daughter. Now, in the film, he is shown to be a pacifist and a drunkard and having an elderly daughter, but actually in real life he wasn't a pacifist. He actually went out and scouted the Zulus before the battle and had a wife and infant children who he went to go and protect, essentially, rather than running away in terror like he does in the film. But that doesn't seem to be what they're going on about. And actually, one of the inaccuracies, I think, is the opposite to being racist or to trying to show the Zulus in a bad light, or black people in a bad light in this instance. Because when you see the cavalry coming back in the film, they are portrayed as white-skinned kind of farmers, so probably some of them being Boers, others being the British farmers in the area. Of course, this was around the Buffalo River, led by Captain Henderson, and in the film they are portrayed as being white, kind of looking like the Boers with European clothing and hats and Winchesters and things like this, whereas in actual fact the majority of those in real life were part of the Natal native horsemen, who would have been dark-skinned apart from the officers who were light-skinned. But actually in the film they're shown as white-skinned, and they are the ones who run away. So again, this is showing that in actual, in the history of the event, they would have been dark-skinned deserters, but they've changed this to make them white-skinned, possibly as a political motive. But then this is going against the narrative that black people are somehow inferior to white people in the film, because of course they've changed the roles around. Now, another is actually that at the end of the film, one of the most moving scenes and one of my favourite scenes is that at the end the British have been fighting for like 10 hours and then suddenly the Zulus appear on the horizon and the British all man their posts and they're thinking, right, here comes the final attack, we're gone now. But instead of attacking, they do this salute. And while this is a beautiful film, beautiful scene, and it's one of my favourites, this never actually happened, and this was invented by the producers. And again, this shows the Zulus in a more positive light, because it shows them not just as savages who only attack and want to kill, but also as recognising the bravery of the British. And it's also at that point that the British recognise the bravery of the Zulus, and they order the soldiers not to start shooting, because obviously this is a display of recognition of the bravery of the soldiers that they had been fighting. And again, this shows them in a much more positive light, whereas in actual fact, the Zulus only stopped attacking when a British column came to the relief of Rorke's Drift, and that's when they retreated away from the superior numbers of the advancing British. Again, this is changing things, so yeah, this is an inaccuracy, but it's not an inaccuracy that makes the film more racist. If anything, it portrays the Zulus in a better light than in the actual historical event of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. Did leave out that potentially could be construed as being racist to make the British seem better than the Zulus, or to leave out something that happened, is that after the battle, many of the wounded Zulus were actually killed. They were obviously lying around, many had been shot, and most of them were bayoneted. But what we do have to remember is that they left this out of the film, so you could say, okay, right, they are showing the British to be better than they actually were, because obviously killing prisoners and the wounded is not really something that we should celebrate, and it obviously goes against the Geneva Convention these days. But what we have to remember is that earlier on the same day at the Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulus showed no mercy to the British wounded and captured there. Not saying it's right for either of them to do it, I condemn the actions, but this is 1879, this was the nature of warfare, and both sides engaged in this, and that they didn't show it in the film is fair enough, because I think again it shows kind of the balance of the two sides, again not trying to make one side better than the other, and I think the film really did a good job at that, of showing both the British and the Zulus as being different but equally brave in their approach to the battle. Now another is that it mentions the distortions and racist overtones, and again I find this hard to find. Of course, it is a film from its time. It was made in the 1960s, and I guess you could argue that there aren't really any black characters in the film. Of course, you have Bromhead and Chard and the Colour Sergeant Bourne and all of these on the British side, but you don't really have any black characters. Rather, you just have the black foe, as in lots of the extras and the Zulus and things. Potentially, you do have King Ketshweo could be construed as a character, but he's not really a main one. But then again, I find it hard to find the distortions and racist overtones when you look at especially the production of the film. So actually the vast majority of the black people in the film were actually Zulus. They hired over 1,000 Zulus to come in as extras and bus them in from Zululand, which was about 100 miles away, at great extra cost, I would imagine, just to make it more accurate so that the Zulus had a better representation. And they even consulted a Zulu tribal historian who would have the stories passed down from his elders about what had happened at the Battle of Isandlwana, so we get a more accurate picture of what went on there, not only from the British side, from the British reports, but also from the Zulu side. And this is very different to, say, if you contrast it to a Western at the time, when you had very clearly white people playing Native American roles, and they just kind of darken their faces but put on war paint, and some of the portrayals of Native Americans are horrendously inaccurate, whereas you can't really say the same in Zulu, because there were Zulu actors playing the Zulus. They consulted Zulu elders who will have known people potentially who fought at the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and Zulu historians, so they really did their research properly. And actually the guy who plays King Ketshweo was a direct descendant of King Ketshweo, and he later on went on to found the Zulu political party, the Inkatha Freedom Party. So they weren't just using any old black people that they picked up off the street. They were using real Zulus, people who knew about the customs. Of course, Zulu society still has this very strong central base around the martial customs, around the warrior class, and this definitely was the case back then, and they really used that, unlike in other films of the time in the 1960s, like the Westerns, for example. Now, as well, when they were filming, this was 1964, this was at the heart of the South African apartheid laws, which were the laws which essentially separated the legal rights of white and black and other races in South Africa. And of course, when they were filming in South Africa, they had to abide by these laws. Although, really, there were several issues that came from this. One is that under the apartheid laws, it was legal to pay people different wages depending on their race for the same job, which of course today is illegal. But actually all the Zulus, there is actually a rumour about Zulu that they weren't allowed to pay their Zulu extras the same amount as the white extras in the film, and that the way they got round this was that they left all the cattle in all the scenes, that you have the cattle kraal, that they left all the cattle behind and paid the Zulus that way. But this is probably not true. It's a bit hard to find out what is and isn't true to do with this rumour. But at the end of the day, all the Zulu extras were paid exactly the same as the white extras in South African rand, so they could have got away with paying them much less, but they paid them exactly the same, which it doesn't sound like much today, but in 1964, South Africa with apartheid in full motion, that is something to be considered. And as well, during the production, there are examples that the crew sort of stood out against the apartheid laws in South Africa at the time. So one of the laws was between sexual proclivity between the different races. That was illegal outside of marriage, and I think there were laws against them marrying as well. So actually the guy who plays Bromhead in the film, is it Bromhead or Chard? I think it's Chard actually, sorry. Chard, he actually went against this law, and he said he learned that it was a flogging offence to have sexual relations with someone outside of your race. So he asked if he could take the flogging while he was in the act of doing that. So, really sticking a middle finger up at the apartheid laws. And as well, one of the white South Africans had a disagreement with one of the black South Africans working on the production and punched him in the face, and he was actually fired on the spot to set an example that wouldn't be tolerated by the film. And again, you might think, well, of course that's logical, but this was 1964, this was South Africa, so I think it was really ahead of its time, especially when you look at the stories of the production crew behind it. And as well, many of the Zulus there had never seen a film before, and there's actually, I didn't want to put it in just in case it had a copyright on it. I couldn't find what the copyright laws around it are, but I'll link it down below. I think it's the Independent article about the production of Zulu. You can actually see the Zulus watching a film for the first time, sitting there and enjoying it. They actually showed them a Western film so that they had more of a grasp of the kind of thing that they were looking for. And there's a really nice quote actually by the same guy, by the descendant of Quechua, who has a really difficult name to pronounce. I would normally try, but I get enough hate for my pronunciation, so I'm just going to ignore it. But actually, he said that, and about the Zulu actors, that they found themselves reenacting the deeds of their own grandfathers. Somehow this drew the audience into what was, in the end, a very human experience. And so we can see here that, and I'm assuming that this is the majority feeling of the black actors of the Zulus, and especially that's the kind of theme that I get from them, is that this was something profound for them, because I don't think a South African film of the time would have allowed them to portray their ancestors in such a positive light. I think they would have just had them be kind of the boogeymen who went against the voortrekkers and things like this. But really this was a deep and symbolic thing for them to be able to reenact kind of the glory days of the Zulu Empire after Shaka, and when they stood up to the British Empire. This was the day after and the same day as the Battle of Isandlwana, when they were able to defeat a British army. And so I think this is a really powerful kind of portrayal of black people in this time, when they held their own, when they were proud, when they were independent, and when they were seen as a worthwhile enemy by the British, who of course were technologically superior to them, but still had a real run for their money and barely made it out by the skin of their teeth to survive and see the next day. And as well, I think that the human experience is something that he, is a nail that he hits exactly on the head, because at the end of the film, when you have they've been firing volley fire and the yard is full of dead and dying Zulus, and I think it's Bromhead then makes the comment about the butcher's yard. And there is a certain undertone of an anti-imperialistic kind of theme there, because there is this kind of question when it's quiet and it's been a very noisy film. You have the Zulu chants, you have the Welshman singing, which by the way didn't happen. There wasn't really this battle, this singing battle between the two. But you have this quiet, there's the smoke everywhere, and in direct contrast to the volley fire that you had, and the Zulu chants and the spears and the cries of dead and dying men. And then you just hear the moaning and the groaning of the wounded on the floor. And you get this real sense as they're standing there and looking over it all, and they really question everything. He's from this military background. His great-grandfather was the Johnny who knelt beside Wolfe as he lay dying at Quebec, and his dad was at Waterloo and all of this. But suddenly he's standing there with all of these dead and dying men in front of him and questioning, what was it all for? Why have we been here? Why have we been fighting tooth and nail to the death at this outpost? And really that is another side of Rorke's drift. It was an incredibly heroic last stand by the British, and it was incredibly well fought by the British, and it involved a lot of bravery for the Zulus involved to charge at these defended locations where the British had incredibly superior technological advantages. But at the end of the day, it was an incredibly insignificant battle in terms of the Anglo-Zulu War. Now, of course, they made it into something much bigger to compensate for the defeat at Isandlwana the same day, which I kind of explained in my video where I said they had 11 Victoria Crosses were handed out, which was huge considering there are only about 150 men there. But there is this sense of what was it all for? And I think that really hits home at the end in that scene. It's not really that implicitly said, but I think that is something that is conveyed there, and I think again that's more of an anti-racist thing. You get a sense of the men questioning, why are we here? Why are we so many miles away from our homes, fighting these tribesmen who at the end of the day were fighting for their homes. Rorke's Drift was within, I shouldn't say that. Rorke's Drift was actually outside of the Zulu territory, but they were fighting to protect their kingdom, the Zulu kingdom, which was being invaded by the British at this time in 1879. Anyway, so thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on, just looking at some of the critiques of Zulu that were put forward by these activists, by these 28 activists in Kent who didn't want it to be shown. And sort of my opinions, I think it's very clear that I don't think Zulu is particularly racist. It's a film of its time. Today it would probably be made differently, but I think it did a very good job at showing both the British and the Zulus as being different, but equally brave in their own way, despite the fact that their cultures were so far apart as it seemed. Now, I would like to know, what do you guys think about this? So please do. I'll put a poll up now, and I will let you all vote in that. Is the film Zulu a racist one or not? Yes or no? So I'm very interested to hear your responses. Please do have a discussion in the comments below. Try and keep it civil. That would be very nice. And big thanks to the Patreons for allowing me to sit down and to make this film. So thanks for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon.